So now that we have reviewed the structure or relationships in the information processing model, let's now look at what happens at each one of those stages with respect to aging. So we're first going to explore sensory memory. And we're going to explore sensory memory, what it looks like, how you probe it, and how long does it last in old versus young people by using two techniques. We're going to use the partial report technique, and we're going to look at the sequential integration of form technique. Let's begin by looking at a very famous paradigm in the history of cognitive psychology, namely Sperling's method of partial report. And this is a method that not only can measure the duration of sensory memory, but actually demonstrate that it even exists in the first place. So what does the method of partial report look like? Well, you begin by showing your participants an array of stimuli. That array of stimuli usually is an array, a matrix of letters. So you might have a matrix of letters that are 4 columns across, 3 rows down for a total of 12 letters. And then what you do is you very briefly present that array of stimulus letters on the screen. And usually you only present them for about 25 milliseconds. Then you ask people, okay, how many of those letters can you recognize? So if you briefly present 12 letters, there's no way anybody can recognize all 12 of those letters, because the trace in sensory memory doesn't last long enough for selective attention to be able to bring all of those stimuli up to the level of recognition. You might be able to get 5, 6 of those items before all the rest of the information fades away. So how long does that information actually last? Well, you can measure that by doing the following. You present that array for 25 milliseconds, then you wait, let's say 100 milliseconds. And then you present a probe that instructs the subject which row to report. Should you report the top row, the middle row, or the bottom row? And remember, this probe does not occur until after the matrix has disappeared. So you show the matrix of stimuli, 25 milliseconds, then it disappears, you wait 100 milliseconds, and you then present the probe. Maybe that probe is a high-pitched tone. That means report the top row of letters. Upon hearing the probe, what you'll find, if it's only 100 milliseconds after the stimuli disappeared, people will get 100% correct performance. What does that mean? That means all the information is in sensory memory when the stimulus disappears, and all that information is still there when the probe is given, because you don't know if the probe is going to be top, middle, or bottom. Once you hear the probe, you have enough time of the sensory information to encode all 4 letters on the line, and you can report them with 100% accuracy. However, if you now take the probe and make it 300, 400, 500 milliseconds following the offset of the stimuli, what you'll eventually do is reach a point where partial report performance no longer holds at 100%. You'll finally have that probe be long enough away in time that the sensory storage begins to degrade, and you will no longer get the full benefit of the partial report procedure. So that's a lot to digest. Let's try to look at a more concrete demonstration of how this procedure works. All right, so let's take a look at the method of partial report and see how the procedure would carry forth. First, what I'm going to do is show you a matrix of letters. It's going to be 4 columns wide, 3 columns deep, so 12 altogether. And what I'm going to do is briefly present the array, and I want you to report as many of the letters as you possibly can. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. Okay, so how many letters could you report? Chances are you could not report all 12. In fact, that's almost a certainty. Really, nobody can do that. You may have gotten 5, 6, 7 of them, so to speak, But then before you could scan your sensory memory and complete the task, the information had faded away. In fact, in a real experiment using the partial report technique, that array would have only been presented for about 25 milliseconds. I can't present it that short using this PowerPoint video presentation, but you get the idea. Doing full report is not possible. However, if we do a partial report task, that is, we briefly show the same array, but we only ask you to report one of the rows, you can do it pretty efficiently if you get the cue in time before your sensory memory runs out. In this case, I'm going to give you the cue before you see it, so you'll have plenty of time before the sensory trace fades to be able to recognize the 4 letters on the bottom row. Here we go. Okay, so what were they? Well, you can probably remember and write them down and be 100% accurate. And those are the typical types of results that we see in a partial report study. Remember, however, in the real paradigm, you don't get the cue until after the stimulus has disappeared. Okay, so what do the results typically look like when you do a partial report experiment? Remembering that what we're looking at down here on the x-axis is the time between the offset of the very briefly presented stimulus and the onset of the cue. So if the cue is presented at 500 milliseconds after offset, and you still are performing near 100% on the partial report task, that would mean that your duration of sensory memory, the duration of which all the information in sensory memory is still available to the subject, would be about 500 milliseconds. And typically what we find in young subjects is as the latency between the offset of the stimulus and the onset of the prompting cue goes from 0 to 500 milliseconds, young people can maintain 100% performance under the prompted partial report technique situation. But after 500 milliseconds, what we see is their performance quickly degrades. So we typically use this type of signature on this curve. They're percent correct as a function of the time of latency between the offset of the stimulus and the prompting probe. We typically take that signature as suggesting that the duration of visual sensory memory is about 500 milliseconds. We can see, number one, in the red curve, that old people can do this partial report test just about as well as older people can, but very interestingly, they actually seem to have information persist in their visual sensory memory buffer for about 20% longer, a full 100 milliseconds longer. So what might this mean? Well, first of all, what these results demonstrate is that older people have a relatively intact visual sensory memory, that their visual sensory memory of anything is a bit longer. And there's some speculation that this could actually provide a bit of a compensatory mechanism for slower selective attention processes. Remember, in the information processing model, we have lots of raw information in our visual sensory memory buffer, more than could possibly be processed by the cognitive systems. But selective attention has to now extract that information from the buffer. Under extreme conditions, it only has 500 milliseconds to do that. And if it had 600 milliseconds instead, that might benefit older people whose selective attention mechanisms have slowed down as they've grown older. Something that's interesting to speculate about. So now we're going to look at another paradigm that can be used to investigate, if you will, the duration of sensory memory. And this technique is called the sequential integration of form procedure. And the first thing we have to know about the sequential integration of form situation is it takes advantage of the fact that when stimuli are presented sequentially and very rapidly, they can be integrated over time and space into a unified perceptual, if you will, object. And that such integration occurs only within a very narrow window of time. And this narrow window of time seems to provide us an index of how long sensory memory persists. Now, that was pretty abstract set of statements I just made. Let's look at what the stimuli look like in a sequential integration of form experiment to make this a little bit more understandable, a little bit more concrete. So we begin with a sequential integration of form study that's going to use three-letter words. So all of the words that are going to be presented in this study is we're going to quickly present three-letter words like the one you're seeing on the screen now, SAT, SAT. And people's job is when they're given the stimuli is to report what three-letter word they just were presented with. But the stimuli are presented in a special way. The first thing we do is we take each of the three-letter word stimuli we're going to use in our experiment, and we split those three-letter words arbitrarily into two stimulus halves. And you see I've done it here with color coding. I've taken the line segments to form the word SAT, and I formed them into two halves, the black half and the green half. And then what one does is, instead of presenting all of those stimuli at the same time, is you present very briefly the first stimulus half, followed very quickly by the second stimulus half. And if that first stimulus half and second stimulus half are presented quickly enough in succession, what the observer perceived is an integrated whole word, SAT, and it's very easy for them to accurately report the word. However, if the time between the presentation of the first stimulus half and the second stimulus half gets too slow, that is, it's so slow that it's beyond the duration of sensory memory, performance begins to break down because the observer no longer can integrate them into a perceptual whole anymore. And that gives us essentially an index of the duration of visual sensory memory, the point at which performance begins to break down. So let's look at the results of an interesting study that was done a couple of decades ago that used the sequential integration of form paradigm to actually show a couple things, to show that sensory memory lasts longer in older people, and that you could set up a particular situation where older people will actually outperform younger people. So let's first look at the black curve here and look at the performance of young people. What we're looking at on the x-axis is the gap of time between the offset of the first stimulus half and the onset of the second stimulus half. When that time is very brief, when it's within the duration of visual sensory memory, young people can integrate it and very accurately report the three-letter word. But very quickly, as that gap becomes longer and longer, what do we see? We see that the young people's recognition performance begins to break down very rapidly because they can no longer integrate the two stimulus halves because the representation of the first half in sensory memory has faded away before the second half is presented. However, in older people, because the information in their sensory buffer decays at a slower rate, they start out performing pretty well, and they maintain good performance long after the young people have started to suffer in their recognition performance. They can integrate the two word halves over a longer interstimulus gap time. Why? Because their sensory memory lasts longer. So that's a pretty interesting finding. I love these studies where you can set up the situation in such a way that you can advantage the old people and enable them to outperform their younger counterparts. And this is one of those examples. And these are usually pretty compelling studies when you can do that. So our conclusion of looking at the essentially results from sequential integration of form, as well as from the partial report task, is that sensory memory is not impaired by normal adult aging. So that brings us now to a consideration of age differences in short-term memory, or what we call in more modern parlance, working memory. And we're going to look at three aspects or three dimensions of short-term memory. We're going to look at its capacity. Gee, how many items can it hold? And then we're going to look at its duration. Okay, once you've deposited a psychological code or object into short-term or working memory, how long does it hang around before it decays? And then finally, we're going to look at a third dimension of working memory, short-term memory, if you will, and that is the speed of processing on the contents of short-term memory. How quickly can we access and process information that's already in our short-term memory? And we'll look at age differences along all three dimensions here. So let's begin at the simplest level. Let's look at a typical way we can quickly assess the capacity of short-term memory. And one of the most common techniques is something called the digit span. And so let's take a little look at what the digit span measurement looks like and what it means. What we typically do in a digit span experiment or assessment is we take single digits, the digits 0 through 9, and we present them one at a time. So and we present them at a given rate. So we present one per second. And after we finish presenting the string of serial digits, we then ask the participant, hey, repeat that string back to us. And if it's a short string, like 2, 3, 9, people have no problem when you prompt them to repeat 2, 3, 9 back very accurately. But what becomes interesting in the digit span task is what we do now is we start with short strings like 5, 8, 2, as we see in the slide, and we make the strings longer and longer. Now, in a 5-digit string, we might say 6, 2, 9, 4, 7, and then our observer has to repeat back 6, 2, 9, 4, 7. Now, if we keep increasing the length of that string longer and longer and longer, we'll eventually find a point where the participant starts to make errors. And that shows us the limit or the capacity of their short-term memory. And if I gave you a set of digits like 7, 9, 5, 1, 3, 2, 8, 1, 5, 9, 4, 2, you would, and I asked you to repeat it back to me, you would go, you would certainly have errors reporting all those, unless you had developed special mnemonic skills. In other words, if you cheated on the task. So the typical way we measure what's called the forward digit span is we find, okay, we give people a sequence of digits, they repeat them back to us in the same order in which they were presented, and their digit span is represented by the longest string that they could repeat error-free. And that's an index of their, if you will, capacity of their short-term memory. Now, there's another little twist on a digit span that we can perform, and that is we can do something called backward digit span. So we give the digits in the same way, one at a time. We make the strings longer and longer until they start to make errors. But now the subject's task is not to report the numbers in the same order in which they were presented, but to present them in the reverse order. And that's why it's called the backward digit span. So what we would typically predict that we would see in forward digit span in a group of young people is we'd expect the average to be 7. And there's a famous paper in the cognitive science literature called The Magical Number 7, plus or minus 2, where George Miller reviewed the literature that showed over and over and over again, no matter what technique you use, you typically find that the average number of items that you can hold in your working memory is 7. And, plus or minus 2, depending on individual differences and the workload imposed by the task. So what we typically see for forward digit span in young adults is just what you'd expect based on the magical number 7. The average number we see is 7. What's the average number we see in 7-year-olds, for example? Well, we typically see only about a half a digit of loss in the average 7-year-old. And you might say, well, how can you get a digit span of 6.5? Remember, that's the average. So maybe half of the 7-year-olds would have a digit span of 7, and maybe the other half would have a digit span of 6, and that would average together as 6.5. So we lose a sort of an imperceptible amount of capacity in our static short-term memory by the time we reach age 70. So that's not too bad. However, we began to see something interesting emerge when we look at the backward digit span data. Typically, for a young person, you would lose a digit when you do backward span instead of forward span. So maybe you'd expect a mean of 6 for backward digit span. What we see at age 70 is an additional digit loss. So instead of the average being 6.5, as we saw on forward digit span, we'd expect to maybe see an average of 5.5. In other words, there's a cost of having to manipulate the items in our working memory and our short-term memory before we repeat them back. So what we typically conclude from measures of, simple, straightforward measures of the capacity of short-term memory is that static short-term memory capacity is relatively intact in old age. And the decrements in the capacity only begin to emerge when we ask the subject to manipulate the contents of short-term memory to a particular extent. In this case of backward digit span, the manipulation we ask them to do is reverse the order in which they reported the result. An analogous measure of capacity of short-term memory is the word span. So instead of using digits, we use words. And words enable us to, do some additional manipulations, if you will, with the recall process. So what do? We present our subjects with a list of words. They have to present the words back to us in the same order. And what we typically find when you do that, you present young and old people with a list of words, they repeat them in the same order, you get a very, very similar performance. Maybe the young people can repeat 7 words, the old people 6.5 on average. But now when you place an additional demand on it, instead of having them give us the words backward, if you have them do something more difficult than that, if you give them a list of words and now they have to report the words alphabetically. So in the example I have here on the screen, if you gave them the words moose, apple, candor, serpent, they would have to say, oh, apple, candor, moose, serpent. They'd have to repeat them back to you in alphabetical order. And when you do that, you begin to see suddenly some significant age differences emerge. And this is characterized in the older population by lots of individual variability. There's lots of old people that look pretty much like young people, lots of old people in the middle that lose a word or two in word span, and lots of old people who are seemingly healthy that do abysmally on this task. And you can see on this bottom bullet I have on the screen here that word span where you have to recall in alphabetical order seems to be especially sensitive to detecting people who are in a state we call mild cognitive impairment. That is, their cognitive impairment is not so severe that they would be diagnosed with a problem such as dementia, for example, but it's impaired enough that it can interfere with some other task of daily living. And this area of defining and treating people with mild cognitive impairment is a really booming area in aging research, because we believe there's this relatively large segment of the so-called healthy 80% I often refer to in the class who might have this certain degree of mild cognitive impairment, and we're developing techniques and capacities to assess them a little bit better. So what would our conclusion be overall about capacity of short-term memory? That it's relatively intact, but rapidly declines when cognitively demanding manipulations are required of working memory. In other words, when we make demands on working memory, we begin to see larger and larger age differences with 70-year-olds compared to 20-year-olds. Now we might ask ourselves the question, not what is the capacity, not how many items can we hold in short-term memory, but once those items have been deposited into short-term memory, how long do they last? And there's a famous paradigm in cognitive psychology that's been developed to answer just that question. It's called the Brown-Peterson paradigm. Now let's suppose we gave people a list of words to remember in their short-term memory. They might actually be able to remember those words for many minutes. They might be able to, 2 minutes later, when we ask them what were the 5 words, and repeat them right back to us without an error. And we might erroneously conclude, oh, well, the duration of their short-term memory was at least 2 minutes. Well, all the science says that it's actually significantly less than 30 seconds. So how come people could report the words after 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, so to speak? Well, the problem was they were rehearsing the words. They kept repeating the words in their own to themselves, talking silently to themselves. And every time they did that refresh of the words using rehearsal mechanisms, the contents of their short-term memory were recharged. They got a new lease on life, and then began to decay again, only to be refreshed again when they rehearse the stimuli the next time. So what that means is, in order to get an accurate measurement of how long the contents of short-term memory last, you have to prevent people from doing rehearsal. And that's what the Brown-Peterson paradigm does. You present the person that you're investigating with the list of words to remember. Then you immediately give them a distraction task to prevent them from rehearsing. Maybe they have to sing a song, for example, or they have to count backwards by 7, or some other task that keeps them from rehearsing. And then what you do is you wait for, let's say 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15, 20 seconds before you say, okay, stop doing the distracting task and tell me what those original words were that you're holding in your short-term memory. And you score them in terms of how accurate they are. And when you use the Brown-Peterson paradigm to measure how long the contents of short-term memory last, you get very compelling results, as we see in this figure on the screen right now. What you can see in this particular slide is down here in the x-axis is what's referred to as the retention interval. That is, how long did you wait from the time you gave people the list to the time you asked them to stop doing the distracting task and report the items. And you can see if you do it immediately with 0 seconds, that is, they never started the distracting task, they're at 100% performance. But even after 9 seconds, they've already decayed about 50%. And by the time you get past 30 seconds, there's nothing left there. It's all gone. They forget everything. So we typically conclude from procedures like the Brown-Peterson paradigm that the duration of short-term memory is about 30 seconds at max. And it quickly degrades unless it's refreshed or operated upon. And what we see in this figure right here in the dashed line is the results of older people. And the results from older people in terms of the rate of decay in of the contents of short-term memory is pretty comparable to that of young people. So there's very modest increases in the rate of decay in short-term memory as people grow older. That is, as we look at healthy older people. So the last aspect of short-term memory we need to consider, beyond capacity, and if you will, beyond the duration or the decay rate of the contents of short-term memory, is the question about speed of access of the contents of short-term memory processes. And again, we're going to look at a very famous paradigm in cognitive science research, and that's the Sternberg memory span paradigm. And let's take a look at what this paradigm is all about. We ask ourselves the question, how fast can we search through the contents of our working memory? How fast can we do that? Well, here's the technique that Sternberg came up with to answer that question. First, what he did was he required participants to hold a number of stimulus items in their memory. So let's, for example, use digits as our stimuli. And let's say, for example, I want you to hold 2 stimuli in your memory, the numbers 2 and numbers 4, right? So those are the numbers you have to hold in your memory, 2 or 4. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to present you with a list of numbers. And every time I give you a number, I want you to answer as quickly as you possibly can, yes or no. Is that number a member of the set that you're holding? Yes. Or no, it's not a member of the set. It's some other number. So if you were, again, holding 2 and 4 in your memory, and I gave you the number 2 as a stimulus, you would say, yes. Yes, it's a member of the set I'm holding, not in my memory. If I said 5, you'd say no. If I said 9, you'd say no. If I said 4, you'd say yes. And so now what we do is we measure the average speed of response, your average reaction time, to maybe 40 such stimuli we present to you while you're holding 2 items in your memory. What happens if you only hold 1 item in your memory? Or if you have to hold 4 items to your memory? What happens to your speed of being able to make that reaction time response? And what we find lawfully over and over and over again is the more items you have to hold in your memory, the longer it takes you to respond. And the slope of that function relating the size of your memory set to your reaction time tells us how quickly you can process information. So let's look at some typical findings on the slide that I'm presenting to you now. If we look at the slope of the function relating the memory set size, how many items you're holding in the memory, and how quickly you can answer yes, no to probe stimuli, we see that the slope of the young people, or that is the amount of slowing that occurs as more and more items are added to the memory set, is accruing at a slower rate than old people. And in fact, if we analyze these slopes, what we typically find is it takes older people about 30% longer. There's 30% slowing in their scanning speed of the contents of their memory. And so this is a very, very significant fact, and it may explain lots of the problems we see in working memory. Gee, why is it that the size of working memory, the capacity of working memory seems to shrink as we make more and more demands? Maybe it's because of the slowing that occurs in our ability to process the information in our short-term memory. And like always, this is just another example of another source of evidence for this universality of the slowing of behavior that we've seen over and over in this class, and that we'll see again in the future. That everything seems to slow down as we grow older, not only how fast we can run, but how fast we can think. And now this brings us to the last stage of the information processing model, and that is we're going to look at age differences in long-term memory. And we're going to explore these age differences in long-term memory by looking at 3 different snapshots. We're going to look at differences in recall versus recognition memory, which has some implications for whether the limiting factors on long-term memory is a storage problem or a retrieval problem. We're also going to look at an application of Creighton-Tobin's depth of processing paradigm to ask ourselves the question of how well new memories are encoded into long-term memory when we're old as compared to when we're young. And then I'll just very quickly mention a little factoid about metamemory and aging to sum up our consideration of the topic of age and memory in general. So let's begin by essentially asking ourselves the question, okay, within the information processing model, if we observe decrements with age in long-term memory, are those decrements due to storage problems, retrieval problems, or perhaps even both? So we're going to explore a couple of classic studies that have addressed this issue. And the first one we're going to look at is an interesting study that was done. This is a classic study. It was done by Schoenfeld and Robertson. And they proposed that the limits of long-term memory performance among older adults were due to retrieval deficits rather than due to problems with storage mechanisms. They actually reviewed the scientific literature and made a good case for this hypothesis that essentially the problems older people have with long-term memory are because of retrieval and not because of storage. And they designed a somewhat simple yet eloquent study to take a look at this hypothesis. So let's take a little bit of a look at their design, and then let's review the results and see if they make sense. So the first thing they did is they sort of followed the zeitgeist of the golden age of gerontology. That is, they made sure they used healthy old subjects as well as healthy young subjects. And then they also decided to assess long-term memory using both the traditional technique of free recall, I'll describe that in more detail in a moment, versus a recognition memory test. And their prediction was the following, that if the problems that older people have in long-term memory are primarily due to a retrieval mechanism, then what they should observe in this experiment is large age differences when you test people using free recall, but only very small age differences, maybe no age differences when you test people using a recognition test instead of a free recall procedure. So now let's look at what they did here. Let's begin by looking at this bottom function that shows their two age groups, their healthy 20-year-olds, their healthy 70-year-olds, and their memory performance when they were given a list of words to remember and tested using free recall at a subsequent time. And what is free recall? Let's suppose I give you 16 words to remember. Then I bring you back tomorrow and I said, okay, here's a sheet of paper, write down as many of the words that you can remember as possible. And then you sit down and you write down as many words as you can. That's the traditional type of way that memory, long-term memory is tested. And when you use that traditional approach, what you find is pretty large age differences in long-term memory performance. Well, what happens now where instead of giving people a free recall test, let's suppose, again, you gave them 16 words to remember, and now you give them a sheet of paper that has 50 words on it. 16 of the words are the same words that you gave them in the list to remember, and the other 34 are distractor words. And now you have people look at that sheet of paper, and their task is to identify the words that they were originally presented with by circling those words. And when you look at the performance of older people now on the recognition memory task, look at how you flattened the curve. First of all, the young people got better because it's easier even for them to do the recognition memory task than the than the recall task. But look what happens to the size of the age difference here. The size of the age difference is, I should say, the size of the performance difference among 7-year-olds is gigantic here, and you flattened out the age difference curve by using the recognition test. That is, when you test people with young and old people with free recall, you see a big age difference. When you test them with recognition techniques, you see a very, very small age difference. And the fact that that long-term memory deficit almost disappeared suggests that the memories were still there. They were up there. They were just harder to access. There was basically a retrieval problem. And this was a very, very important finding that stimulated lots and lots of research. Some people kind of overinterpret this finding, however, and what they believed it meant was that there were no storage difficulties, no deficits in the way new memories were formed in older adults. There was just some sort of problem with retrieval mechanisms, not in the storage itself. However, there's clear evidence that not only are there retrieval problems, but there are also problems in the way new memories are formed, the way they're encoded, and, if you will, integrated into the existing long-term memory network. And let's look at a technique that has been widely used to address such issues. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look at age differences within the context of something that's called the depth of processing paradigm. And what the depth of processing paradigm says is something like this, that when new long-term memories are formed, that is, when the contents of objects in short-term memory are incorporated into this large network of representations that we have to support long-term memory, when that encoding process takes place, when that linking of the new information to the old storage structures occurs, that the more sophisticated, the more extensive those new links are, the more likely you will be to remember that new content in the future. And how do you manipulate the formation of these new memories in such a way that you either have sparse connections established or very rich and extensive connections established between the new memory and the old memories in the long-term memory network. Well, Craik and Tolving came up with a very, very fascinating way of making that manipulation to manipulate the depth of processing for new items that are being entered into long-term memory. And let's look at this depth of processing protocol and a study that was done using young and old healthy observers to see what happens to the depth of processing effect as people age. So again, in this experimental design, we have groups of young people and groups of old people. They're all selected to be healthy individuals. And the participants are given lists of words to inspect with the instructions that later their memory for those words is going to be tested. And essentially, people process those words under 4 different experimental conditions. And those 4 different experimental conditions were designed so that they either require very little cognitive effort or work on the stimuli, or they require lots of cognitive work on the stimuli. And the idea is the more deeply and extensively you have to process the stimuli while they're in short-term memory, the more rich the links will be that are established in long-term memory and consequently benefit their accessibility and recall in the future. That's the so-called depth of processing effect. What you predict is the more deeply you process the stimuli, the more likely you will be to recall them in the future. And what Craik and Tolving did was showed here's a way to scientifically and systematically manipulate depth of processing. So let's look at the 4 experimental conditions that were used to manipulate depth of processing. In the first group, the young and old people were shown words, and every time they saw a new word, they were asked to do a very simple task, to count the number of letters in the word. And that has been demonstrated in previous research to require very, very little cognitive effort. The second group were shown the words, but now instead of counting the number of letters, they needed to generate a rhyme for each of those words. So let's suppose the word was car. Your task would be to generate some rhyme for it. One that comes to mind to me easily is bar. And for each word that's presented, you generate a rhyme and say that rhyme out loud. And it's been shown that generating a rhyme requires more cognitive effort than counting the number of letters in a word. And the third level of the independent variable here, levels of processing, was the young and old people were given the same list to remember. But now, instead of either counting the numbers or generating a rhyme, now what they had to do was generate an appropriate adjective to describe the word in the list. So again, if the word was car, they might have to provide an appropriate adjective for it. Oh, fast car. So let's suppose the word was cloud. And an appropriate adjective for a cloud might be ominous or dark, a dark cloud. It wouldn't make sense, would it, to say a friendly cloud? That would be considered an inappropriate adjective. So this requirement to generate an appropriate adjective to modify or describe the stimuli in the word list is thought to require more cognitive processing than generating a rhyme. And then finally, the 4th level of the experimental manipulation was to ask people to form a vivid image in their mind's eye of each object in the list of words to be remembered. So again, using the car example, you might envision a nice, fast, shiny Ferrari, close your eyes, imagine it on a racetrack, some visual elaboration. That takes a lot of cognitive effort to do that, and that's shown to be even more effortful than essentially generating a rhyme or generating an appropriate adjective. So what Craik and Tolving were able to show is that when you use these types of manipulations for essentially studying list of words or being exposed to list of words to be remembered, The more deeply you process the words, the more likely you will be to recall them at a subsequent time, maybe later that same day or maybe later that same week. And what you typically see in the results of these types of experiments is depicted by this black line showing you the results of the young people in the experiment I just described. That as we went from very shallow levels of processing, counting the number of letters in a word, up to the most elaborate and effortful, generating a visual image of the stimulus, we see that memory gets better and better and better, just in sync with the predictions of the more effort, the more cognitive elaboration, the deeper you process the stimulus, the more likely you will be able to recall it in the future. And so that's, that result is entirely consistent with this depth of processing model. But what's somewhat alarming is that this experiment and others, replications, have shown that the level of processing effect is quite flat, in some cases non-existent in older populations. Older participants demonstrate little or no depth of processing advantage. And what that suggests is that new memories that are formed in long-term memory they may be somewhat impoverished. They may not be as interconnected with the long-term memory network as the new memories that are formed in young people. And that might actually change the magnitude of knowledge that can be extracted in certain cognitive situations, and certainly could have an impact on the ability to recall those newly formed memories in the future, since they're not as interconnected with the existing framework. So finally, to end our brief consideration, our tour through the topic of age and memory as cognitive scientists might examine it, we need to mention a topic called metamemory. And what metamemory refers to is the awareness of our own memory capabilities. Think of it as kind of our own self-monitoring of our memory performance. Someone asks you, for example, the name of someone who, starred in a particular movie, and you may not be able to recall that name, but you know that somewhere in your memory it's there. You might say, gee, just give me a few minutes and I know I'll be able to remember it. But at other times, somebody might ask you and you might say, no, I don't have a clue. And you're very, very confident that you don't really know and you never will be able to remember who it is. Or in the first example I gave you, yeah, you know it's up there in your memory and it'll eventually come out. Of course, these days, the way we answer those questions is to quickly pull out our smartphone and look it up. I actually like to not use my smartphone and exercise my memory and work it to try to get those connections reestablished. And it's kind of, if you think of it, it's kind of like brain exercise. And I'm kind of hoping that will preserve my own long-term memory system a bit more than it might otherwise as I grow older myself. So what research on metamemory has shown is that many aspects of this ability to self-monitor and be aware of our own successes and failures in our memory are pretty well preserved in old age. So that's pretty cool. That means that we are pretty good at monitoring problems that we have with our memory and can take appropriate actions. But there's one sort of chink in our armor with respect to metamemory when we get older. And that exception is that older persons have been found to be more prone to what we call high confidence affirmative recognition errors. Now, what the heck does that mean? We're more likely to suffer from high confidence affirmative recognition errors. So what is an affirmative recognition error? It's a false positive. You see something and you recognize it. Oh, I have seen that before. I have read that before. That feeling of knowing. And when you have that feeling of knowing that you have experienced something before and it's wrong, that is, you actually never have seen that building before, you never actually have seen that painting before, that when we make these false positives, these affirmative recognition errors, we tend to have very high confidence in them. We tend to be sure of our memory. Whereas when those types of things occur in younger people, they tend to report lower confidence in their memory. And if you have a lower confidence in a memory that's wrong, you're going to be less likely to act out on that memory, to do something, to make a decision based on that false memory. Not so much, however, when you're older. So these are types of things that are sort of on the bleeding edge of studies of cognition and aging, about how these metamemorial systems work. And we're learning more and more about these phenomena all the time. And one thing that's really sort of promising about metamemory approaches to cognition is that metamemory can be trained. And we can learn different techniques to monitor our own memories, etc. And that suggests that as we learn more and more about these processes, we'll be able to come up with schemes and techniques that help older people manage their memories better and therefore lead more fulfilling and active lives. All right, so the next topic we'll be covering in our course sequence in aging is the topic of conditioning and memory. And that will be topics to be covered in video lectures next week. Stay healthy, and don't forget to wash your hands.